Good afternoon, everyone. So this is what the graveyard shift looks like. Actually, a fair few numbers more than I expected. So yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for coming out and coming to listen to me. As Rob said, my name's Nick, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to safely assess operational technology environments. I recognise a few faces in the crowd actually, and they've assured me that they're going to keep the heckling down to a minimum. Clicker. There we go. Okay, so the structure of today. It's going to be 3 key points. We're going to cover the why, the how, and then finally we're going to dive into a little bit of detail as well. And so the why is basically to provide a bit of background. So why am I here today to talk to you about OT? What's the current landscape that we're looking at? The how is we're going to briefly introduce a few concepts and what the objective was and the reason for this talk. And then the detail is we'll bury down and start getting stuck into the nitty-gritty of it, as it were. Just a point, I've talked about OT so far in here. That's fairly interchangeable with SCADA, ICS, control system, whatever suits and whatever fits, it's roughly the same thing, but we're going to focus on the whole environment as well, and not just the technology that's in there. So today's learning. If I deliver this talk as intended and it goes well, a couple of key points that you'll be able to take away from this. First of all, the top one, being able to assess as an industry and individually, being able to assess OT environments is very important. We're going to look at some of the impacts of what can happen if we don't assess and people don't have their security house in order with regards to OT. It can be kind of messy. We're going to talk about the priorities, so safety and availability are very key in this space. And we're going to talk about an approach. So, as an industry, how do we approach this as a challenge? How do we assess OT systems without knocking them over, causing explosions, that sort of good stuff. Probably at this point it's worth pointing out what this talk isn't, and it's not me standing here telling you about vulnerabilities in SCADA kit from 10 and 15 years ago. We're going to focus on more of a pragmatic approach to how we might, as an industry, cover this challenge. So I've said a lot about OT and SCADA, but ultimately why should you listen to me? So it says up there on the slide, my job title is the Global Head of Technical Direction at BSI. And so it turns out that BSI do a little bit more than standards these days. We actually have a security division there as well, and that's where I work currently. I'm 7 years pen test experience, ex-check team leader, seen quite a lot of different systems, sites, networks, technologies over the years. And actually, in the past, I was also an ex-SCADA design engineer, so what it all basically culminates in is I know quite a lot about SCADA and OT from before, and now bringing that in and working to deliver solutions to clients and things like that. I have a little anecdote about a time when I was a design engineer where things didn't go particularly well. I've just been told we're really tight on time, so I'll probably cover that one at the end or afterwards. It doesn't paint me in a good light anyway, so that's probably not a bad thing. So let's cover and focus on the why. So why we're here today and what's the purpose of this talk. So basically I've found a couple of snippets of headlines from news, articles, websites, that sort of thing, which paints the impact of a compromise on OT quite well. So the first one we've got here is this headline at the top right, which is Triton is the most murderous malware and it's spreading. Okay, it's probably slightly heavy in terms of the title itself. Maybe it's a little scaremongering. I kind of put it in here just to highlight the impact or the potential impact. And pretty much the Triton malware actually contained code, or does contain code, which can fully disable safety systems. So when we talk about a safety system here, this is something that runs alongside a SCADA system, which can prevent a catastrophic accident should the SCADA fail. And this malware itself actually had the ability to shut that kind of system down. What the actual malware was supposed to do, according to analysis, is it was intended to cause an explosion at a petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia. It ultimately failed because there was a slight error in the code. However, it kind of impacts the impact's kind of highlighted there in that you know, if that was the case, the safety measures would have been disabled. It would have caused an explosion. The good chances are that someone would have lost a life or lost a limb or whatever it might have been, and caused, you know, great danger. The second one I've pulled out is related to a sewage attack. This one actually dates back to the year 2000, and is from Australia, and it's related to basically a SCADA company who'd put in a system in a sewage works in Australia. One guy got fired from the SCADA company. He then tried to work at the company that bought the SCADA service, the SCADA kit network. Didn't get the job a few times, and ultimately then started driving around the various sites with a bit of kit in his car, some radio equipment, and then started controlling the SCADA system from outside the gates. And the ultimate impact was there's about 264,000 gallons of raw sewage pumped into local parks, residential areas, that sort of thing. So in terms of the impact, again, that highlights you know, what we're talking about here, and the impact is pretty great. In this one, it's an environmental impact. So sorry about this. It's an ICS talk, SCADA talk. I tried not to put anything about Stuxnet in. It turns out that you can't do it. It's quite difficult. I've gone modern day. I've gone for Stuxnet 2.0, which is around from end of 2018. Again, the impact of this one was intended to overspin a centrifuge at a nuclear plant, such that it basically fell apart, didn't work, blew up, whatever it were. Again, the impact of that would have been, was quite high. It set back Iran's nuclear program by quite a few years. Depending on where you sit in a political scene, that might be a good or a bad thing. I don't know. I suppose Russia weren't too happy about it. And then the fourth one is quite cheeky. I think I've put it in here. It's very recent as well. And there was an article about the Venezuelan power outage, which is from maybe 2 weeks ago, something like that. Still ongoing as far as I can tell. And there's an article about, you know, could this be a result of a cyber attack? I must point out at this stage there's no attribution and no analysis which suggests that it is, other than a couple of articles that looks like it's come from Russia or something. But ultimately, the headline's there. You know, we hear in the news quite a lot about, you know, can Russian hackers turn off the lights, and can the Chinese shut down the power grid and that sort of thing? I guess ultimately the answer is yes, potentially, but it just highlights the impact again. And so when we talk about these impacts, these are from, you know, the compromises that would happen. But ultimately, as a testing or a set of testers in an industry, if we pen test an OT system incorrectly, the chances are we might see, you know, some of these same impacts if you take out a piece, you know, part of a process, and it's not safely managed. You know, what's to say that this wouldn't happen to us? So let's talk a little bit about the security landscape that we're dealing with in 2019, and specifically with OT. So as we've known for many years, OT security is a long way behind IT security. I think the general rule of thumb suggests it's around 10 years behind. I might contest that. I think it's probably a little closer these days than it has been in the past. The problem we've got is there's a lot of OT systems have been around for, you know, 20, 25 years, still in situation now, still in use. They're a legacy bit of kit. No one likes to touch them because they just run and operate and work well. Chances are they're probably not being patched in forever as well. On top of that, we've got some new directives. So the NIS directive came around last year, so 10th of May 2018 in the UK. It kind of got overshadowed, I think, a lot by GDPR. And so it kind of flew under the radar a little bit. It's a pretty good directive, I think. Stands up on its own right as well. The landscape as well, we've got further convergence of OT and IT. There seems to be a lot of pressure from corporates and things like that to allow access into OT from a corporate environment. So things like, pulling out data from a SCADA system to inform business decisions. A lot of that's going on, and so there's a lot more connectivity these days than there used to be in the past. Traditionally, there would have been air gaps, and that's no longer the case these days. And so when you combine all those factors together, the impacts as well, considering we're kind of in a position as an industry where we are going to be asked and called upon more often to assess these environments. And if we look at the priorities, a lot of people, or a lot of security professionals, will recognise this. It's the CIA triad. I just decided to do it in bars for some reason. Ultimately, we know a lot about this. We know confidentiality is pretty big. It talks about data loss, data loss prevention, GDPR, that sort of thing. Integrity is also pretty high, and availability, it's important, but it's probably not as high as the other two. Example is Facebook was offline yesterday for quite some time, and as far as I could tell, no one died or had a problem. It just came back on later on, and I suppose Twitter had a few more users that day, but that's pretty much how it goes. When we look at OT, however, it does change somewhat. We have now got 4 things to consider, and there's a new one on there called safety. It generally goes safety is the highest priority. So we, an OT operator, a SCADA engineer, doesn't want to kill people, doesn't want to injure people, and so that's their priority. Availability is very high on there as well. They need to be able to have the system online pretty much all the time. There is no room for downtime. And then we've got integrity and confidentiality. Again, integrity is quite important. Confidentiality, not so much these days. So just to reiterate, safety number 1, availability is number 2, and then we had confidentiality and integrity quite down. Key point about integrity, it is very important in an OT environment actually, but just doesn't quite compare to the two at the top. As an operator of a SCADA system, you need to have confidence in what's going off. What you're seeing on screen is what's actually happening in the process. And so when we talk about OT, we want to talk about assessing it. So there is going to be a need to assess OT here, and more so moving forwards. So we've got the, as we've seen, the impacts of doing so could be quite high. The impact of not doing so, again, could be quite high. So I don't think we've got a choice. I think we have to assess them. We need to, look at the real-world risk. And as a tester, pen testing is obviously one method of doing so. But it does have its problems. It is risky by nature. So a simple Nmap scan of an old PLC can quite easily knock it over to the point where it might not come back. Safety and availability we always have to maintain as per the priorities, but if we're doing Nmap scans of things that fall over, can we guarantee that? Probably not. And testing environments, they don't really exist, and the ones I have seen that do exist, generally not representative. So again, are we going to get the benefits there? And the NIS directives mean that we can't actually ignore OT systems anymore. In the past, they would have generally been ignored. That's air gaps. Let's not worry about that too much. It runs. It's not a problem. We've got everything under control. These days, it's kind of changing a little bit, and we're not in that position anymore. Okay, so that's the why. Hopefully, that's given a bit of a background. The impacts are pretty bad. We, as an industry, need to do more and be able to assess them better than we do at the moment. So we're now going to cover the how. This is kind of high level, this section. And so the how was to develop a robust and bespoke hybrid approach to assessing OT systems. Okay. And we did that 2 ways. We had a governance approach. So we're talking about the NIS directive and using that. We're talking about our own OT risk assessment framework, or risk assessment management framework that we put together and wrote and used in anger quite a few times. And then we've got testing. So obviously testing won't go away. It's something we're good at as an industry. And today's talk is about bridging that gap and how do we make it more approachable for pen testers and things like that. A couple of options there. You've got test environment or test bed testing. Testing with familiar techniques. I want to try and show that it's not as scary and as problematic as it might be. And then we've got controlled production testing. So yes, it is possible to test in a live SCADA environment and not cause explosions and spillages and maim people and chop legs off and things like that. So first of all, we will focus on governance, and that will take us into the detail. So I've mentioned it already in this talk. NIS directive came around, like I said, in May 2018. It's very important for operators of essential services. So that's things like utilities, energy providers, telecommunications, I guess transport as well. And essentially it boils down into four objectives, and the colouring on that is not great. Anyway, Objective A is all about managing security risk. So that's things like structures, policies, procedures, which govern an organisation's approach. Objective B is around the protecting of the cyber attack. So that's having appropriate security measures in place to protect against a cyber attack. Objective C is around detecting cybersecurity events. So that's having the capability to detect and monitor incidents as they happen. And Objective D is around the minimising the impacts of cybersecurity incidents. So, can we get a process up and running quickly again if it does get compromised and taken offline? We're not going to talk much more about the NIS directive here today. We could probably spend a good 45 minutes on it on its own and diving into each of the objectives and sub-objectives in there. Just one point to note is, in my opinion, I think it's pretty good. It's all-encompassing. It covers quite a lot of things and it's clear and concise. The outcomes are quite measurable. And it does tie quite nicely into other areas as well. Governance stuff again. Now we're going to talk about the OT framework that we developed here in BSI and I've used quite a few times. We've basically fallen back to things that exist already in a lot of cases and then modified and added and basically made those other bits that weren't there fit and work for us and the clients that we actually work with. So we've actually gone along the lines of using IEC 62443 principles. We've gone and used the NIST 882 guideline and the ISO 27001 framework. Now, the benefits of this approach is it's very low risk, so the chances of us doing this and something in an OT environment falling over and setting on fire is almost none. It does give a holistic, high-level view of the wider environment itself. And there's an emphasis within that framework of security being a continual process. So for me, especially in SCADA and ICS, you see a lot of products out there which claim to fix all your issues, and I guess the same extends to IT as well. Silver bullets, I suppose. Me personally, I'm a big fan of doing multiple basics, the right basics, doing them well, and doing them in multiple layers to give the levels of resiliency that you need there. So the risk management framework, it is something we created. You can find out more information on the website. There's a white paper around it and things like that. It's very bespoke on a per client basis. And like I said, it pulls on existing things, which we'll dive into a little bit more now. So the IEC 62443 set of principles which aim to allow you to assess and look at a SCADA system, and that's pretty much how it works. There's a concept in there around zones and conduits. So a zone would be a grouping of assets, let's say, that work in a particular level within an OT environment. And then a conduit is how those zones and levels may talk to each other. And the idea is that you can group certain assets together. So you might have SCADA operator workstations, you might have field devices, PLCs, and you might have your I/O all grouped into different zones. The conduits are how those zones talk to each other, and obviously you'd look then for segmentation between the zones, things like that. And you can then do your risk treatment on the zones and the groups as well. We use NIST 882 guidelines. It stands up on its own right as a great guideline, in my opinion. It basically covers how to secure ICS and SCADA systems. It's quite in-depth. But we use it predominantly to show what good architecture looks like, to be able to measure good architecture, and to baseline the good stuff. And so when we come to do an assessment, we can say, yeah, this is what this kind of system looks like, a good version of it. Whereabouts are you on that scale, and how do you compare to it? ISO 27001, something we're probably all aware of, at least in terms of the name. A little shout out to the mothership here. It was originally a British standard before it got moved into the international standards. It is an IT standard predominantly, but there's a hell of a lot of good stuff in there which is very relevant and useful to OT as well. And so things, think about third-party access and connectivity. Think about supply chain and physical controls. What architecture might be good in conjunction with the NIST. What user access management look like, joiners, movers, leavers, policies, that sort of thing. There's a fair bit in there that's not useful, and we chop out all those bits that are fairly IT specific or not relevant to that particular client. And what it does, it gives a big high-level view of the OT environment. And so when you run one of these, it can typically take, I don't know, say 20 days, maybe a little less. Essentially, you're looking at all these things here. You're getting an holistic assessment, highlighting the key risk areas, and you're encompassing many domains of the environment. So, all the users, the policies, the procedures, third-party access, all that good stuff is in there as well. We've got the outwards in effect. So we're looking at, everything that's coming in towards the IT from an outside point of view. So that might be the internet bases. You might be talking about interconnected networks or adjacent networks. And actually, it combines really well with the NIST directive itself. So we can directly map on one to the other quite happily. So, a little case study around that. We had a client come to us who had a challenge around baseline and focusing the future efforts in their OT. It was an energy provider. And this is where this framework was born out of. So this started before the NIS came in. And basically, they wanted us to develop this for them, a bespoke risk management framework. Once we'd agreed it, signed it off, they were happy with it. We then assessed against that. And that's provided them with maps onto NIS. It gives them a good road back forward about their security posture here and what they're doing, and where their future investment should be directed. And that then ties us into the next stage. As part of that future investment is around testing and how they approach testing, especially around new sites that are being commissioned, that sort of thing. I've put a little arrow up on here. So we talked about testing as an approach. You've got test environment and test bed testing, very low risk, moving down the chain. Obviously, controlled production testing is really quite high risk stuff, but not insurmountable. So talk about a test environment. This is like the holy grail of OT testing, let's say. If you're in here having a nice time, there's a lot of things you can do in here you wouldn't dream of doing in a production OT system. So, we can do fuzzing, we can, do buffer overflows, that sort of thing, or we can look for them at least. Fuzzing generally has some good results. So we've done a test recently where we were doing some protocol level fuzzing to see what the implementation was like. And we ended up with a PLC that had crashed, effectively burned and didn't ever recover and had to be shipped back to the manufacturer in the end. That's not something you want to be doing on a production site that's actually controlling a piece of equipment. An honourable mention as well at the bottom there for bounce testing. Again, this is not something you do in a production place, but let's take a motor, for example. Let's say we've got a PLC controlling a motor. What are the outcomes? What would happen if we spun that motor quicker than was deemed safe? So, push it beyond its safe operating limits. Is there something else that steps in there and stops the motor from running? Or does it just, go on and actually crash, burn, set on fire, that sort of thing? Again, like I said, none of these things you would do in a production environment. It's really is stuff that you would do in a lab only. So talking about testing with familiar techniques, and one thing I find in the security industry, especially among pen testers that don't have SCADA experience, is to a certain extent a little fear. So it's a case of, I can't test that, I don't know much about it, I don't know enough about SCADA. Well, I'm trying to break that down a little bit and really talk about the fact that when we do a SCADA test, there's just familiar techniques in there. It's stuff that we already know about as testers, you know. There is a report by Dragos, which is an ICS specialist company in the US, and they look back at the 2018 ICS vulnerabilities. Only 34% out of those 443 CVEs that they reviewed were involving ICS-specific protocols. And that means that there's 293 vulnerabilities in SCADA kit that we're actually using fairly standard protocols. So think HTTP, FTP. As testers, they're protocols that we know, and we know them well. We can test them. So why can't we do the same things in a SCADA environment? I find a lot of OT environments, actually, some of the ones I've seen at least, have been backed by a Windows domain. Sure, we know Windows domains. We can own them every day, especially if they're unpatched and haven't been touched from a maintenance point of view for years. There's a couple of malware strains out there using live off the land techniques nowadays, as opposed to anything specialist. So we've got, some in there with Mimikatz, some in there with Metasploit payloads, and a few off-the-shelf exploits like the Eternal Blue. They're all in the, for example, the Triton one has all that stuff in there. So essentially OT, yeah, it's kind of specialist in some aspects, and it only really gets to the endpoints. There's a lot of stuff in there that's very familiar to us as testers, and there's no reason for it to be scary. The only scary bit is the impact of doing it wrong, which we're going to cover now. So there is chance to do a test in production. It's not, like I say, it's not for everyone. You need a client who's definitely on board with that. It is probably, quite risk averse. Essentially, like I say, it's very risky, but there is a way to do it and also maintain the safety and availability of the system that you're testing. So we've got non-critical processes, so you might test them first, have a look at what you can do. Start slow, so if you're doing an Nmap, scale back the max rate, the timings and things like that. Ramp it up if you need to, but crucially, we're not going to be kicking Nmap off on a SCADA system and then disappearing for lunch. It's probably not the best place to be. Certainly work with the client, so you will always need buy-in for this kind of testing. But maybe there's some things that you can implement to, safety gates. So, perhaps put in place a safety system around a process which, if the SCADA goes offline or the kit falls over, the safety piece will kick in and you maybe just control it manually for a short period. And also having a process engineer with you, so someone who knows the network and knows the process inside out is very key. As testers, we need to have an appreciation for the whole process that we're testing and the whole system we're looking at. But we don't need to know in depth. We don't need to know the ladder logic or anything that's going off. We just need to know how it works and have an appreciation for that. And if you have someone else with you who does that day in, day out and knows that network very well and that environment very well, they're going to be an incredible resource for you. Final bit, TAC-SIM. Yeah, it's covered this morning in the panel. Yeah, of course you can do it. It's not a problem. You just need significant buy-in and planning and all the bits that we just talked about, the control gates, the safety gates, and everything else is all got to be in place as well. There is a case study. I think we're getting short for time. Yeah? No worries. Here you go. There's further information if you need it. There's a white paper there. And hopefully that's sort of painted a small picture of how we can approach it as an industry a little better and a hybrid approach.